Chapter 17 is looking at manifest destiny, the goal by some people in the United States at this time to expand from sea to sea and in some very extreme cases from pole to pole. So we're looking at 1841 to 1848. Now, when last we left off with Texas, remember Texas had declared themselves an independent country from Mexico over that issue of slavery, and it's been about 8 years at this point, and Mexico is still declaring that Texas is just a province in rebellion. Now, the reality is Texas was never going back to Mexico at this point. They were able to keep outside of Mexico for about 8 years. But nonetheless, Mexico is very definite in terms of them getting Texas back. They also threatened the United States if they chose to step in. Remember, Mexico is already angry at the United States for recognizing an independent Texas. So there were threats made against the United States to keep your nose out of our business. Now, from a British perspective, for Great Britain, it would have been advantageous for them to keep Texas as an independent country. They did not want the United States to get their mittens on Texas and make them a state, because now they could trade with Texas as an independent country, avoid American tariffs, and still get cotton and other things that are being produced down in Texas. But this issue of slavery is kind of a big deal, because Texas is adamant about keeping slavery, but Great Britain had recently abolished slavery. There is a strong abolitionist sentiment in Great Britain, and so Southern Americans were fearful that if Great Britain created a sphere of influence around Texas, that it would affect this issue of slavery and it could possibly expand elsewhere as well, aka the United States. So it comes down to the 1844 election. This is a very hot button issue in the United States at this time over whether or not we should annex Texas, whether or not Texas should become a state in the United States. Southerners are fearful that Great Britain are going to get their claws into Texas, and they wanted to ensure another slave state in order to maintain their power balance in the Senate. The Democrats nominated James K. Polk. He was kind of the dark horse of this election. Not much was really known about him that much. And the Whig candidate, once again, is Henry Clay. This is one of the sole issues in the 1844 election, this and the issue of Oregon, which we'll talk about in a second. And from the Southern perspective, either we annex Texas or there could possibly be disunion. From a Northern perspective, a Northern Democrat perspective, they wanted to annex Texas to make their Southern counterparts happy, but at the same time they wanted to acquire Oregon as well. Like I said, we'll talk about that in a second. Henry Clay's perspective on this issue is that an expansion into Texas would just mean an expansion of slavery. So he was against annexing Texas. Well, when James K. Polk was declared the winner in 1844, the sitting president, John Tyler, who was a lame duck at this point because he obviously had not won. In fact, he had not even been nominated for the 1844 election, took this as a popular mandate, meaning that the majority of the people in the United States were in favor of annexing Texas. And so through a joint resolution of Congress, meaning just a simple majority in both the House and the Senate, Texas became the 28th state. Now, Mexico is obviously extremely angry. They see the annexation of Texas as the United States stealing Texas away from them. Now, the reality is Mexico had not had Texas for 9 years at this point. There's no way they were going to get them back at this point. Now, on to Oregon. This idea of manifest destiny, like I said, expanding from coast to coast, that many Americans felt it was our God-given right to expand from coast to coast. And this term manifest destiny is that we are manifestly designed by God, that God is on our side. He wants us to expand from coast to coast. It doesn't just end with Texas. Many people in favor of manifest destiny were also looking to acquire the Oregon country. Now, the Oregon country has long had some disputes between the major countries of the world. Oregon country, its extreme boundary is considered everything west of the Rocky Mountains all the way to the Pacific Ocean, and north of California all the way to the 5440 parallel. This today is the southern tip of Alaska. So what was once considered part of the Oregon country is part of today modern day Canada as well. Now, Spain had given up any claim that they had during that Florida Purchase Agreement, so they're out of the running. Great Britain, though, has a slightly stronger claim to this territory, namely the fact that Great Britain occupies all of this territory north of the Columbia River. They're living there, they've explored there, they've had treaty rights, etc. So this gives Great Britain a pretty good claim on at least part of the Oregon country north of the Columbia River. Now, the United States' claim on the Oregon country is slightly weaker. Our original claim was, oh, well, Lewis and Clark explored through this region, but this is obviously a very weak claim. What starts to strengthen America's claim to the Oregon country is the occupation of the territory specifically around the Willamette River Valley starting in the 1830s and 1840s. Americans moving west on the overland trails, namely the Oregon Trail, out west to live out in Oregon gives us a much better claim. So the United States started looking at a possible solution, a possible compromise with Great Britain. It was not worth going to war with Great Britain over who's going to occupy all of the Oregon country. And so a compromise treaty was created between the United States and Great Britain, where the United States would occupy half of the Oregon country up to the 49th parallel, which is today our modern-day northern boundary, and the rest would belong to Great Britain in Canada. So this Oregon fever really helped to add to our claim of controlling at least half of the Oregon country. Now, from the American perspective, it was not worth going to war with Great Britain over this issue, especially since the United States was about to have a war with Mexico. Here you see where the extreme boundary line is, all the way up here to the 5440 parallel, which is, say, the southern tip of Alaska, and where the compromised line was drawn at the 49th parallel. This now becomes the United States' property. Now, how all of this plays into the 1844 election, we already know about this issue of whether or not by electing James K. Polk that this is a popular mandate. Now, Henry Clay, as we've already talked about, was against annexing Texas simply because he saw it as an expansion of slavery. And we see a lot of different slogans being thrown around during the 1844 election. Northern Democrats saying all of Oregon or none, or 5440 or fight. That's from a Northern Democrat perspective. Southern Democrats obviously advocating for all of Texas. The Whigs, in the case Henry Clay, saying Clay, Union, and Liberty, and that a vote for Polk was a vote for slavery and Texas. So this is really a hot button issue in 1844, this expansion into the West. Now, the election of James K. Polk did lead us to the annexation of Texas, but in the state of New York, there is a small third party, the Liberty Party, that actually worked as a spoiler party, which means people who voted for the Liberty Party were absolutely against the expansion of slavery. But by voting for the Liberty Party, this took away votes from Henry Clay and thus gave the state of New York to James K. Polk and thus the entire election because he had enough electoral votes to be named the winner. So from John Tyler's perspective, the fact that he said that this was a popular mandate is somewhat untrue simply because people voting in the state of New York, for example, weren't voting for slavery. In fact, they were voting against slavery when they voted for the Liberty Party. But regardless of how he got there, James K. Polk was now the president, a one-term president, in and out. But within his 4 years, he had four major goals in which he wanted to accomplish. Now remember, James K. Polk is a Southerner, and so one of his first goals in office is to lower the tariff. Remember, a lower tariff helps those Southern farmers because number one, the goods that they buy in the United States aren't going to be as expensive, and number two, they're not going to face those retaliatory tariffs overseas. So named after the Secretary of the Treasury, Robert Walker, we see the Walker Tariff of 1846 actually having a reduction down to 25%. His second major goal as President of the United States is to restore that independent treasury. Now, this is kind of the final nail in the coffin for the Bank of the United States. The Whigs had still been somewhat hopeful that the Bank of the United States could possibly come back. By creating this independent treasury, this really shows that it's not going to happen. And then his last two goals are all about manifest destiny, specifically acquiring the Oregon country. Now, even though he had promised during the war or during the campaign to get all of Oregon, the reality was that this wasn't going to happen. He actually was only able to acquire half of the Oregon country up to that 49th parallel. So to Northern Democrats, this is kind of a slap in the face. You know, they were wondering, why did we support you, James K. Polk, in this election? The Southerners got all of Texas. This is a huge amount of land that they got that they could potentially expand slavery into. But Northern Democrats only got half of Oregon. This really upset many of the Northern Democrats who had voted for James K. Polk in the previous election. And last but not least on his list of goals was to acquire California, which is going to be the focus of the Mexican-American War coming next.